used to go to meetings where everything really sounded good, but somehow I would come out of the meeting feeling like what happened or feeling uncomfortable. It really, many things bothered me.
The agenda of the meeting is to move you from your traditional language over to a transformational structure of language. You come to the meeting thinking about the issue and the situation that you're trying to solve, the needs you have, not knowing the structure of the meeting has been changed. And they call this a paradigm shift. And so without you knowing it, yes, you participate, but in reality, the switching or the moving of the group's language did not allow you to clearly present your position.
But I've gone into many meetings, from a constitutional standpoint. Now, the Constitution to me is a very specific document. It says you are to do this. It doesn't say maybe you ought to do this. It's very specific. And to me, that would be the law. That should be, there shouldn't be any conversation, but yet there is conversation.
Right.
How do you explain that?
The facilitator, and there's a structure that takes place. First, you have to have a diverse group of people, and that's not hard to find. That's the world we live in. Then you have to dialogue to a consensus. Now, that's different than a constitutional republic form of government that uses Robert's Rules of Order, which gives you 10 minutes. That's enough time to present facts to persuade someone else of your position. And this process, though, this dialoguing to a consensus, is a destruction of that. To go to the consensus process, everyone must be willing to participate in the dialogue. That means you have to lower the group down to the common denominator that everybody can participate. When you do that, it's usually over a social issue. There's a crisis, lots of feelings involved. You come in, if the group can be focusing on or brought to focus on those feelings at an intense level, and you come in with a positioned statement. In other words, you're not going to dialogue to a consensus. You're going to hold to principles. You're going to hold to your conscience. You find that the group begins putting pressure on you, even your friends. If the facilitator does it well enough, your friends will turn on you, and you'll hear, well, don't be so negative and divisive and hateful and intolerant. And that's all basically to convert you to the consensus process. The words are used that are used are ambiguous. They're broad enough for everybody to participate in. For instance, the Constitution says general welfare. Well, general welfare has a very broad definition, and the courts did this. In the 40s and 50s, they realized that, okay, now we don't want to look back to what the framing fathers said. They conveniently said we don't understand what they meant. So they began turning to society to determine what general welfare was, or all of these words in the Constitution. And so by doing that, they forced the language from specific. Some of our framing fathers warned us about these words. You always have to include the danger of the word in any time that you're setting policy with the good of the word. And the role of the facilitator is to prevent specifics, a clear definition of that word. Because in that agenda, that arena, by making it an ambiguous word, I can include everybody in the room. In other words, we're not going to go to one group versus another group. And if you can't, as a facilitator, maintain the ambiguity, you cannot come to a consensus. And the consensus is not conscience. I don't want the people in the room, for instance, as a politician, to vote their conscience, because language, again, is the key to this whole thing. The language of the conscience is traditional language. It's patriotic language. Even if you're a liberal, if you don't like conservatives or patriotic, you have to realize your conscience only recognizes patriotic language. And that's the language of cannot, must not, thou shalt not, Congress shall not. God says thou shalt not, traditional parent says you cannot. It's a fact, it's a truth, it's a law. It's the I know language. In other words, there are preset standards, and you're going to hold to 2 plus 2 is 4. And the operative verb there is the being verb is. E is mc squared. The laws of nature, the laws of God, the laws of the land are foundational. Now, to come into a room with that language and hold to one position on a definition of a word, the facilitator realizes there's no way we're ever going to get to a consensus. We just have a motley group of people bickering and complaining. We have a majority vote, and we cannot socialize them. We cannot change how they think. So that's the traditional language that has to be undermined. That has to be removed from the way that we think. The moving language, the transitional language that I want most of the people in the room to use is the language of ought to be, should be, might be, could be. You tell your children you're going to be in at 10 o'clock, and you might hear, well, I ought to be able to stay out later. It's like algebra. Anytime you hear an ought to be, an is under attack.
Right.
So if I can get most of your friends going, well, we ought to be able to solve this problem. Why aren't we solving this problem? Well, you're over there going, cannot, must not, thou shalt not, trying to solve the problem with your standards. And I don't want individual standards. I don't want conscience to make the decision. Consensus is a different political system. It is a socialist structure.
Right.
It is a destruction of a constitutional republic form of government, because consensus means with sensation. And so now we as a group, whether this is the group grade in the classroom, the team building in the workplace, it's called total quality management for the workers, total quality leadership for the military, the DARE program, the COPS program, the HMO, acronym after acronym, every vocation is being pulled into getting in diverse groups, dialoguing to a consensus, which means we decide what's right and wrong based upon the collective.
Right.
No longer any preset standard guiding us. And the role of the facilitator is to make sure that most of those people in that room, anytime you set a policy, are into the ought to be language. That then puts pressure on those principled people, those conscience-based people, to compromise, because none of us like alienation. If you come into a room and you have your community there, and say 20 members of your community, and you've been involved in policy in the past, and you let the facilitator up front, and he gets your community to go ought to be, and you're going to hold to your guns, you're going to hold to your standard, you're going to stand alone. And none of us like that. And so the fear of rejection and alienation, which hurts, doesn't matter if you're 10, 20, 40, 80, it hurts. And social psychologists, social engineers knew that by simply utilizing that language, it would put such pressure on you, you'd be willing to change. Rights actually are being undermined in these meetings.
Right, exactly.
Because once you move away from this didactic, patriarchic language, through what they call matriarch, that's transitional language, that's relationship, feeling language. You hurt my feelings, and then you're sitting there going, well, I like this person, how can I rephrase my standards? How can I rearrange who I am for the sake of the relationship?
Right.
Now the third language, and this is the language the facilitator is using in the room, the language of ambiguity is the language they call theory. They want everybody to practice theory. In fact, if you go to the psychology department, you look through the books, you go sociology, you go through culture, you go through even world history now, or global education, you'll see theory and practice. In other words, we now have to practice theory. We don't practice contract, because contract is the verb is. That produces sovereignty, that produces nations, and that produces war. Right. So I have to get you to buy into the ought to be language, because that makes you part of your community, that socializes you. And then if you learn well enough, you'll eventually get over to the theory language of I think, or it seems to me. Now, when you treat a seems to me or a theory as a fact, you're in an illusion. But the role of the social psychologist, the facilitator, is to use the room to move, the group of people, to move anyone in there who's didactic through transition, and eventually get them over to think there are no absolutes, everything is in theory. We're just discovering. And we heard the phrase reinventing government. We should have been frightened. Reinvent, what does that mean? Right. Well, we went into a theory. We don't know where we're going, but that's okay. We have joined the socialist mindset. We have abandoned our constitutional republic form of government. If I can progressively get you to compromise in Senate meetings, in subcommittees, a little, in a matter of 3 years, in fact, and sometimes within half a year, I can get you to think totally different. You're going to go back to your constituents, not thinking about their facts and their position. You're going to be thinking, what will the group back in Washington think about this? And then how can I change whoever's talking to me to move from their position over and change? Whether they come my way or not, I want them to change, because once they learn this process, then we're no longer hung up on standing alone. And it sounds good, see, this is world peace.
Oh, I know, it really sounds, but is it world peace?
No, it is the destruction of the conscience. And we're seeing this all over the nation.